I'm really thrilled to be with you here this morning. You have a really fabulous team to work with, just so you know. They're very warm and generous and incredibly organized, which is amazing. I'm really grateful for the invitation to worship with you today, and I've heard such great things about your community here. And it's really beautiful to have a glimpse of how you come together to celebrate God's presence. I love Blair, and I've known him for decades now. He's a fabulous guy. I do love, however, to see how a congregation operates in the absence of their leader. I witnessed today a long passing of the peace, always a healthy sign in a congregation, when you have to play a song to get people back to their seats. And I think it's a great sign of health and strength that your community is full of people ready to take on leadership and fully participate in the Spirit of Christ. My name is Ryan Tristan Chapman, and I am a candidate for ministry in the United Church of Canada. Last spring, I completed 2 master's degrees at the Vancouver School of Theology, the standard Master of Divinity towards ordination, alongside a Master's of Interreligious and Indigenous Studies. While at the Vancouver School of Theology, I had the pleasure to attend to one of my favorite pastimes, gardening. With Rabbi Laura Duhan-Kaplan, we created an interfaith garden tour for different faith communities to come together to discuss their theology through their experiences of gardening at their faith's center of worship. Believe it or not, this experience has come into play when ruminating over the parable we heard earlier in preparation for today. Parables, as you are no doubt aware, are slippery, with many readings possible for each one. Jesus spoke in these elusive, sometimes puzzling stories. This text in particular is a tough passage. I'm going to be honest. I asked around to fellow preachers. When I asked one fellow preacher of her help, her read on it, she said, "Good luck." Other ministers I spoke to said they looked forward to seeing what I do with it. And some said that they were grateful to not be preaching on this passage, or happen to have a weekend off. The traditional reading of this parable is that it lends itself to stewardship campaigns, fundraising, encouraging wise investments, and big returns. Sometimes the word for currency, the ancient word talents, is directly translated, a bit of an anachronism since it comes from the Middle Ages, but it's used as an interpretation against the cautionary tale against burying or guarding your treasure or your talents and not investing them or using them to serve God. Often the wealthy landlord that you heard about, the slave owner, is assumed to be a representation of God. However, this reading does not sit well with some people, including me. In my understanding of the Bible, there's one overarching message, in that God and Christ's teachings lead us to question authority, human structure and human assumptions about who is the most deserving. Reading the Bible through a lens of social justice, that we are called to be justice-seeking people, and many biblical themes include love for the outcast, welcoming the stranger, and generally recognizing the underdog and learning the poorest hold wisdom, which can reveal God's new order. Christ spoke up against empire, greed, systemic oppression. Jesus challenged the dominant culture and empire, so much so that he was put to death, subject to the death of a criminal at that. Directly following this set of parables is a declaration by Jesus, which lends itself to a countercultural, radical reading of this passage. So mere moments later in the Bible is a passage you are probably familiar with. Jesus declares that by serving the outcast and poor, we are seeking justice, as he taught his followers. It's just one chapter later in Matthew 25, Jesus says, Come, you that are blessed by my God, inherit the kingdom prepared from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Jesus explains, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of the family, you did it to me. A reading of this parable of the talents, which follows the teachings and contexts of Christ's lessons, leads us to reconsider who the hero in this story might be and who we should be attentive to. In this countercultural reading of the parable, we learn to observe the third slave who buries his money and is outcast for refusing to serve a slave master who is brutal, a slave master accused of profiting without respect to laws or boundaries. The slave master does not deny these charges either, of reaping where he did not sow and gathering where he did not scatter seed. Instead, the master punishes and banishes the slave who spoke out against his immoral practices and unfair profits. William Herzog encourages the reader to consider that third slave as a whistleblower, calling attention to injustice. This third slave speaks truth to power and accuses the owner of being hard-hearted. This owner is becoming rich off of others' labors. When his business practices come into question, he dismisses the slave as lazy, which you may notice is still a favorite way to dismiss the poor to this day. The context of the original audience of this parable also lends itself to a more radical reading. We need to remember that Jesus was speaking to the poor, to peasants and farmers. His audience was not the upper and rich class, nor wealthy landowners, slave owners. Jesus used these farming metaphors because they spoke to his audience and helped make his message relatable. In his telling of this parable, Jesus likely would have been demonstrating that he stood on the side of his audience and that he understood the exploitation they faced. The original audience would have been familiar with agrarian practices. They likely would have been farmers themselves. For poor farmers, the idea of burying money was probably humorous, probably a joke. They understood that true wealth came from God, that nature provided all the elements required to sustain humankind, and that money does not bear fruit. Burying the money would have been a symbolic gesture, contrasting financial wealth and agrarian provision. Financial markets sustain king and kingdom at the expense of the poor laboring population. It also helps to understand the hyperbolic nature of the units of money at play here. So they weighed a talent, one singular talent, the least that was given, weighed between 59 and 73 pounds. It was equivalent to about 15 years worth of a typical laborer's wage. So these are not small sums to be trifled with. Some translations offer about 2.5 million as the approximate equivalent today. So this isn't a bit of money, but a huge responsibility being put on three slaves, while their owner goes away for an indeterminate amount of time and returns by surprise. Given how the story unfolds, he expects tremendous returns. In the ancient financial market, where the story is set, the most one could expect fairly on investments was about 12%. To his original audiences, the 100% return rate, it would not have just been unreasonable. It would have been considered dishonorable, predatory, bizarre, and deplorable. Not only that, but it would have elicited disgust from the peasants listening to Jesus. This is because such greed would have caused imbalance, jeopardizing the equilibrium of society. At the time, stability was held at much higher esteem than self-advancement. Landowners also would not have been held in high esteem by these peasant audiences. which Jesus addressed. Extorting and exploiting laborers continued these destructive cycles of poverty through creating inescapable debt. In a world in which farmers would often lose their land due to these unfair financial systems, the third slave in this story, bearing the master's money, has an added layer of meaning. He would have been a hero for taking that money out of circulation, halting that particular 70-pound money from continuing the cycle of exploitation. One final note on this radical reading. The traditional reading usually describes the landowner as God and ignores a fairly important detail. The slave owner is clearly described as a man. This entire tale is not a tale of the kingdom of God, but of man and on earth, and the roles each person has within systems of production, labor, exploitation, and oppression. The audience was being encouraged to stay attentive and aware of the impact of their individual choices. So that's history, but how might we apply this today? While the traditional tendency has lent itself to a capitalist reading, with modern readers considering ourselves as one of these slaves of God, the landlord, a shift in perspective will help us understand both the original intent and our role within the lesson being taught. What if we are, in fact, more in line with the rich land and slave owner? In a global economy, we can't argue that even the poorest amongst us are wealthy, settled comfortably in North America, with amenities many around the world cannot hope to ever aspire to. This isn't to say we should feel guilty, but that we should examine our place within such economic systems which we know lead to inequality, oppression, and exploitation. The hyperbolic nature of this story, with decades of wages or millions of today's dollars at play, can really easily be illustrated. But such illustrations should not be used to excuse ourselves from examining our own actions and their consequences. For example, one fairly simple reading involves, I'm sorry to invoke his name, but Donald Trump, giving 3 employees huge sums of money, ridiculous sums of money. The 2 employees who were given the largest sum of money double what was taken, return it to Trump, and they're given additional tasks and responsibilities. You might also note, in both the original reading and this, the slaves don't benefit. They're giving more duty. They're in the joy of the master. They're entering into the joy of the master. So it's the joy of the master that they're serving. More jobs, more work for them. So Donald Trump gives these 3 employees huge amounts of money, and the third, who is given the least amount of money, returns the same sum to Trump. When he does this, he highlights Trump's illegal and unfair business practices, his wrath, and Trump, without hesitance, says to his employee, "You're fired." The landowner in this parable can also easily be compared to a modern corporation which is known for insider trading and global economic exploitation. Today, we're desensitized to the power of money. People are rich. Celebrities are famous just for being rich. Self-advancement and high-return investments have become unremarkable and even expected. And those suffering in lower classes and the global south are so oppressed that they are often forced to remain silent. Imagine the role this third peasant could play today in today's economy. This reading, in which I was supported by the writing of William Herzog, Ched Myers, and Eric DeBode, models a social gospel interpretation rather than the prosperity gospel which came to popularity in puritanical America. In trying to apply this parable to our own lives and context in today's church communities, we might ask ourselves how we might fully embrace and support those at the margins, where the third slave is exiled as a result of speaking up and refusing to play into his master's unfair, profitable practices. I wonder if you today might think here how your church and yourself might leap into those risky situations and call out these oppressive practices? How might we choose the God of justice, follow the oppressed, rather than the God of empire, ownership, and greed? I'm glad to be worshiping in a community today in which funds and energy are being invested in the marginalized and oppressed. I see you have an active role in supporting First United downtown. I see that you're sponsoring Syrian refugees and your own community and neighborhood. I'm proud to be a part of the United Church of Canada, which is known for being at the forefront of theological inclusion. And yet, I believe we are called to do more, to follow in the spirit and teachings of Jesus. We are called to embrace the least of these, as if they are the very one we follow, treating the marginalized as we would Jesus Christ. The social justice portion of your website declares one of my favorite biblical passages, which we actually sang earlier today, Micah 6:8. So how might we, I ask, seek justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God? I'm sorry I don't have the answers, but I am grateful to Jesus for posing this question and for encouraging us to stay attentive and be aware of our impacts. So dream big, take a risky leap to land firmly on the other side of justice and solidarity with the oppressed. We are called here to risk true solidarity, and as a church, we can truly live into the call of living at the margins, walking alongside the poor and oppressed. In Jesus' name, amen.